A gente está ao vivo, então, agora no YouTube, para começar o nosso seminário. Então, boa tarde a todas e a todos. Começamos hoje o nosso 9º Seminário Discente, da pós-graduação do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da USP. Eu sou a Ana Flávia, sou aluna de doutorado aqui do IRI e coordenadora da comissão organizadora do seminário. Gostaria de dar boas-vindas a todo mundo aqui na mesa e declarar oficialmente aberto o nosso seminário, né, pelos próximos 3 dias. Agora já foi o primeiro, né, no caso. Antes de começar, eu queria agradecer todo mundo que está assistindo a gente aqui no YouTube e prestigiando o evento, todo mundo que participou, submetendo o trabalho e apresentando. Hoje a gente já teve o primeiro painel, que foi muito bom, e começaram os workshops. E, sobretudo, eu queria agradecer a minha comissão organizadora, que me ajudou nesses 3 meses de muito trabalho. Então, o Alexandre, a Kim, o Felipe, a Natália, o Rafael, a Tamires, o Tomás, o Vitor e o Vinícius, que foram incríveis. Eu não poderia deixar de citar o nome deles aqui. Então, para a gente começar a nossa mesa, eu vou apresentar o Eric e o Gabriel, professor Helleiner. Um pouco difícil falar o nome. E aí eu vou mudar para inglês, porque o nosso evento vai ser em inglês. Então, I will introduce Professor Helleiner. I am so hard at this, I'm so sorry. And Gabriel. And then we can start it. So Dr. Eric Helleiner is a professor at the Department of Political Science and Basel School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo. He has authored and edited 11 books, including The Forgotten Foundations of Bretton Woods 2014, The Status Quo Crisis for 2014, and The Governing the World's Biggest Market 2018. He's currently completing a global intellectual history of new mercantilist thought. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and presently co-editor with Jonathan Chrysler of the book series Cornwell Studies in Money. And Gabriel Brasil is a lead political analyst at the Control Risc and holds a master's degree at the Institute of International Relations at the University of São Paulo, our house. His research is on the structure of Brazilian financial market based on banking internationalization and the participation of foreign banks in national markets. He's a bachelor degree in economics from the Federal University of Minas Gerais with a joint period in Belgium, and he's also a technician in administration. Thank you so much, both of you, for coming here today. Thank you, Professor Maria, for helping and mediating this table. I will pass the screen for you guys now, and we can start.
Great. Shall I start, Anna?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Thank you, Ana Flavia. Eric, please.
Okay. Thanks very much for inviting me, Ana Flavia, and delighted to be in this discussion and on the roundtable with the others. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person in Brazil and to meet everybody, but I'm grateful that technology can bring us together. We were speaking beforehand about this is one of the small things that has been good about the pandemic is people getting used to doing things via technological platforms like this. And I hope after the pandemic is over that we don't maybe travel quite as much as we did before. Since this is a roundtable format, I was asked just to make some informal comments about where the global political economy might be going in the post-pandemic context. So I'm going to keep these comments relatively informal. I won't use a PowerPoint presentation. And in some ways, the informality is appropriate to the subject because it's obviously very difficult to predict the future, and particularly difficult in this context where we don't know when the pandemic may end or even if it will end soon. And I should note that scholars of international political economy are not really in the business of predicting the future. We have other people who try to do that, and it's not something we do very well. And I was involved in some debates after the 2008 financial crisis about whether we should be attempting to predict at all. I think we have a role to play in thinking about the future because we have a sense of historical change. And so I think it is our role, but we have to obviously be very careful about having any seriousness about the predictions. So what I thought I would focus on is the future, more specifically, of global economic governance, and to highlight how some changes that began before the pandemic, I think, have been accelerated by the pandemic. And I really want to make four core points as a way of generating some discussion. And I should say, I'm very aware that my focus may reflect the fact that I live in Canada and things may look very different in Brazil, but I'm very interested in hearing about that, and so I look forward to the discussion. So what are my four core points? I'll just say them very quickly, and then I'll go through them in order. The first is that I think global economic governance after the pandemic will need to adapt to a heightened interest in state economic activism of various kinds in many, many different countries around the world. I think we are seeing a move away from neoliberal conceptions of economic governance at the domestic level in many, many countries. Not everywhere, but in many places. The second key point is that adjusting global economic governance to that domestic reality in the post-pandemic context is not a new issue. That this is exactly the issue that faced the architects of the Bretton Woods system, who were trying to construct a system of multilateralism that accommodated a high degree of state economic activism. So in that sense, the problem is not new. The third core point is to say that you might then think, well, Bretton Woods is in some ways a model for the situation we're going to face after the pandemic. And that is not my view. I think that Bretton Woods in many ways is not a model. It had the same problematic at its core, but as I'll highlight, there were so many blind spots at Bretton Woods that we don't want to repeat. And I'll try to highlight at least some of those. And then the final point is to say, if we're going to construct a system of global economic governance which is different in that way after the pandemic, it's also going to have to be very different than Bretton Woods' centralized conception of global economic governance. This is going to have to be a much more decentralized version, and I'll go through what I mean by that shortly. So let me just begin at the first point. I think it's a very basic point. I don't know if it resonates in Brazil, but it certainly would resonate in many countries around the world. And that's the sense that the pandemic has brought a higher degree of state economic activism. So there's been a very dramatic, fiscal and monetary activism, both just simply for economic stability reasons, financial stability reasons, but also a heightened interest in social security in terms of government spending, social security measures, and all this, I think, has reinforced a shift away from neoliberal conceptions. And I should say, this was already, I think, beginning before the pandemic, a kind of disillusionment with neoliberal fiscal monetary discipline. But I think it has been accelerated in this context. And what I want to emphasize here is it's not just Keynes, if you like, neo-Keynesian and social welfarist conceptions. I think equally, if not more important, is the growing interest in kind of industrial policy and developmentalism in a broad sense. And so again, we saw that before the pandemic, especially I think since the 2008 financial crisis, a growing interest in developmentalist ideas, a kind of discrediting of the US, of the Anglo-American neoliberal model, and intensified interest everywhere, including in the big powers. So, Trump obviously, but Biden is repeating many of these interest in industrial policy. In China, of course, the Made in 2025 policy is a massive industrial policy kind of program, but in many, many other parts of the world as well. And even countries that are not interested in kind of what I like to call neo-mercantilist policies, for lack of a better word, even countries that aren't interested are feeling like they need to do it. So one of my favorite quotes I saw recently from a top European Union official who said, look, we're seeing the world is becoming more and more protectionist and we must be prepared. And so, even kind of reluctantly recognizing that everybody is moving to a higher degree of activism. And I think it's been reinforced by this kind of discourse of build back better after the pandemic. And those conceptions of planned ways to do that and to reduce vulnerabilities often to global supply chains and foster resilience among national champions. People are describing this as a kind of shift from just in time to just in case kinds of manufacturing and supply chain issues. So that's my first point, is to say global economic governance will need to adjust to that. that in the neoliberal era, the point of global economic governance was constraining states. They're constructing global institutions and global rules that were constraints in many ways, and that was the Hayekian conception. And yet here we are in a situation where governments want to do more, and so I think global economic governance will need to be more accommodating of that, but even more supportive of forms of economic activism. And just as an anecdote here, some of you may have seen a recent IMF staff working paper on industrial policy, which was titled "The Return of the Policy That Shall Not Be Named." And so here we have even the IMF, saying we need to take this seriously, and here's the ways in which we think you can do it well. And so that's a different kind of global economic governance, accommodating and supportive of a greater degree of state economic activism. So that's the first point. Second point is just to emphasize that this is not a new issue. In fact, in some ways, it's very close to the situation facing the architects of the Bretton Woods system in 1944. They wanted to have, rebuild an open world economy, but one that was compatible with high degrees of government economic activism that had become very popular in the 1930s. And so they're really trying to pioneer what they see as a new form of multilateral cooperation that can accommodate, but also actively support new forms of economic activism. Now, in some cases, that was activism of a kind of Keynesian welfare state kind. So that's certainly the American New Dealers at Bretton Woods, or the British, like Keynes himself was obviously a major architect of Bretton Woods. But it's also true of many countries that were less industrialized at the time who were interested in developmentalist goals. So I don't need to tell you, in the Brazilian audience, that Latin America was very prominent at Bretton Woods. It was almost half of the delegations at the Bretton Woods Conference came from Latin America. And Latin American governments played a very big role. They were less interested in ideas of Keynesian welfare states. They were more interested in developmentalist policies that had become very popular in the 1930s. And what they were saying at the conference was, we will sign up to the Bretton Woods agreements only if they are supportive of our developmentalist goals. And so the Brazilian delegation, for example, which I'm sure people in the audience here know better than I do, but I've read some of the archives, and it's really striking that the Brazilian delegates are saying, we need a support for our development goals, state-led development goals. And so that's, maybe the World Bank can support that with development lending, or larger IMF balance of payments lending to help commodity exporters and the kind of volatility of commodity prices. That's the kind of thing Brazil was interested in. But it was also true of India, which was not yet independent in 1944, but was represented at the conference. And there were many nationalists on their delegation who, again, were interested in state-led developmentalism. It's also true of China that was represented at the conference. It's often ignored in histories of Bretton Woods that focus so much on the British and the American role. But China was the second largest delegation at the conference at Bretton Woods, and they were interested and inspired by Sun Yat-sen's ideas from the 1920s in state-led developmentalism. And they even have an alternative plan to the Keynes plan and the White plan, which is promoting that idea. So the result of those discussions was the invention of a new kind of global economic governance. That was the big innovation of Bretton Woods that John Ruggie has described as a kind of embedded liberal order, where you're constructing multilateral institutions and rules that are reconciling international economic openness with a high degree of government economic activism. And it's partly welfarist Keynesian ideas, but it's also developmentalist ideas. So it seems to me we're moving back to a similar point. It's a similar concern of how do we reconcile openness and multilateral cooperation with a degree of state economic activism. Now, just before I go to the third point, I just want to highlight, in some ways, the situation is very different because we're coming at this problem from the opposite direction. In 1944, they were trying to rebuild an open world economy. That's, because of the collapse of the world economy in the 1930s and the World War experience. We are living in an extremely integrated global economy, and we're trying to move back to that Bretton Woods point, if you like, where we're trying to reduce the hyper-globalization, as Danny Roderick calls it, and transform existing global economic institutions and rules in a direction that that will be more accommodating and supportive of government economic activism. Now, in some ways, this is an easier task than the Bretton Woods architects had because the institutions already exist. You're just trying to transform them in new directions. But in some ways, it's a harder task because there's so many vested interests in the existing system that need to be confronted in order to reform the system in that way. So it's a different political situation. Okay, let me go to the third point, which is, so I've been highlighting the kind of similarity to the Bretton Woods moment in terms of broad goals, but I just want to emphasize on the third point that I don't think we want to return to Bretton Woods. So this is not saying, let's go back to the ideas that they invented in 1944 and resurrect them. And there are many reasons for that, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that I've been researching recently I thought you might find interesting, possibly, which is that the Bretton Woods system really ignored some really central issues in our own time. And so Bretton Woods was very innovative for its time. That's certainly true. I don't want to deny that. But they said less about all kinds of issues that are central to our own politics in the early 21st century. And in that sense, I don't think Bretton Woods is a model for us. Let me just give you some examples. There are many examples I could give. I just want to give you some examples. Environmental issues. If you go through the Bretton Woods discussions, there's virtually no mention of environmental issues. There's no sense of ecological limits amongst the people at the Bretton Woods conference. They were kind of in a high modernist sense of promoting rapid industrial growth, extractivism via resources, and no sense of constraints. I'll just give you a quote here from the US Treasury Secretary, who at the conference, or it was actually after the conference, he said, "The point of Bretton Woods was to create a dynamic world economy in which peoples of every nation will be able to enjoy increasingly the fruits of material progress on an earth infinitely blessed with natural resources." There's no sense of a constraint there, and also no sense of concern for the future. So in the archives, I found a fascinating discussion where someone was reporting on the negotiations on creating the World Bank, and the person said, "I sense in our conversations with all these countries that they have a vision of their country just being covered with smokestacks." And then someone else said, "Oh, so what's going to happen when the Arabian desert is covered with factories?" And Harry Dexter White, the lead figure at the conference, said, "Don't worry about it. Some of us are going to be dead a long time by then." And so it's just a sense of there's no ecological constraint. That's not the concern. And you might think, well, that's because people weren't interested in environmental issues back then. I actually don't think that's true. There's all kinds of debate at that time about conservation and its relationship to international trade rules. The League had discussed this with respect to the protection of endangered species, and there were debates about deforestation and all kinds of issues. It's just they were ignored at Bretton Woods. It's not a priority. In that sense, it's not a model. Let me just give you a second example, which is issues around gender inequality, which I think are central to the politics of our time. Again, no discussion of this at the conference. I spent a lot of time trying to find a discussion. It was pretty striking because there was a dramatic display of gender inequality at the conference itself. Almost all the delegates were men. There were 2 women out of almost 200 delegates at the conference. At the same time, the secretarial staff, which was working on a 24-hour basis on 3 different shifts constantly, was almost all women. And nobody commented on that at the conference. There's not even any discussion of a broader issue of the relationship of gender inequality to issues of global economic governance. And you might say, well, that's because people weren't interested in that time. This is a more modern issue. But this, again, not true. There had been active debates in the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization about the relationship between gender inequality and the global economy. In fact, even 2 months before the Bretton Woods conference at the Philadelphia conference of the ILO, they're endorsing ideas about equal pay for equal work, and that just gets no attention at Bretton Woods whatsoever. So once again, Bretton Woods is not a model, I think, for us in that sense. Let me just mention 2 other quick issues. One is around imperialism and colonialism, which again gets almost no discussion at the conference. And it was striking because much of the world at that time was not represented at Bretton Woods because these were colonized regions. So most of Africa is not represented, much of Asia is not represented at the conference. The only exceptions were India which was still colonized but was represented as a British colony. And the other exception was the Philippines, which was still colonized, but the Americans had promised it independence after the war, and so it was represented. The Indians at the conference do try to get some discussion of British-Indian colonial relations discussed around the sterling balances, but that's pushed off the table. And colonialism, in fact, was even baked into the outcome of Bretton Woods, that the size of IMF quotas were determined for countries like the Netherlands, for example, on a basis that included the trade of their colonies. And there was private discussion amongst the American delegates about how unfair this really was, and were they endorsing, Dutch colonization of Indonesia? But there was a decision not to discuss it because it would be too controversial at the conference. So again, if we're talking about returning to, kind of an embedded liberalism, we want an embedded liberalism that gives more voice to the less powerful, a different kind of multilateral cooperation that rejects imperialism and coloniality in a broader sense. And let me just mention one other example. I think it's an equally important one, which is there was no discussion at the conference of regionalism. Bretton Woods was based on a universal model. This was a single set of multilateral rules and institutions with universal relevance. That was their conception. And again, there was lots of discussion in other places at that time about the need for regions to have a big role in the post-war world order, and kind of the limits of universalism in the sense that different regions had distinctive needs and cultures. There's even a lot of discussion in the early 1940s about civilizational plurality, discussion of how Asia, Middle East, and Africa, had different cultural traditions that might intersect with political economy in ways that needed to be discussed. So this is the Pan-Asian movement, the Pan-Islamic movement, the Pan-African ideologies at the time. There's an active discussion in Latin America, which many of you will know better than me. But if you think of Aya de la Torre's APRA movement coming out of Peru that then spreads across the region, and again, he's saying reject the mental colonialism of Western thought and develop a kind of political economy that's appropriate to what he called the historical time space of the Indo-American region. All of that kind of thing is ignored at Bretton Woods. This was a universalistic vision. And I think in the current context, if we're trying to rebuild a kind of embedded liberalism, it needs to be much more sensitive to the role of regions and the role more generally of distinctive cultures and civilizational traditions and their relationship to analyses of political economy. If I can just quote from a fellow Canadian IPE scholar, Robert Cox, he made this point about a decade ago where he said, unlike economics, IPE cannot be an abstract science. Of its nature, IPE incorporates human concerns and intentions for social transformation and ethical values. And cultures and civilizations differ about these things. The English-speaking world, long hegemonic in the dissemination of thought about global affairs, will need to listen more carefully to other voices in a global dialogue. Susan Strange's appeal for an open range, and she made this appeal about how IPE needs to incorporate many disciplines. Cox says, Susan Strange's appeal for an open range now requires an openness to an understanding of the perspectives of all the civilizations that encounter each other in every world crisis. I think that's the sentiment that is more appropriate to our age, and it's one that was very absent from Bretton Woods, which was a universalistic conception of political economy. So just to sum up this third point, and I'll finish up shortly, I think there are lots of issues that Bretton Woods ignored, but I want to emphasize it deliberately ignored. It's not that these are new issues that suddenly we're paying attention to now. These are issues that had been discussed at the time, but the Bretton Woods Conference chose not to discuss them. Environmental issues, gender inequality, kind of power relations that are related to imperialism, colonialism, and issues of regionalism and civilizational pluralism or cultural pluralism. Okay, let me finish up with the fourth and final point. I hope I've not taken too much of your time. And that's to say that as you think about the kind of global economic governance that could be constructed in this context. And I just want to emphasize that we are living in a context, as I hope you would agree with me, in which multilateral cooperation is getting more difficult. And it's partly a context of declining American power, growing rivalry with China, but also I think a broader inward-looking focus of polities around the world. I think about the weaknesses of cooperation in the context of responding to the pandemic. I mean, it's really striking to me, at least in Canada, how we could have done it much better if we had stronger multilateral cooperation. And so I think, we have to be very conscious of the politics of multilateral cooperation in the current era. They're just more difficult than they were even a decade ago. And so if we're thinking about the kind of idea of constructing or reforming the existing global economic governance system to be more supportive and accommodating of higher degrees of state economic activism, I don't think you can do that on a centralized model. And that's what Bretton Woods was. It was, a couple of institutions at the core, IMF and World Bank, a single set of multilateral rules. I think that's just politically unrealistic in the current era. Those institutions will remain, but we're going to see much more decentralized forms of governance. I think Danny Roderick, describes this well as a light and flexible kind of multilateralism. That's the only thing that I think can fly successfully in the current era. And so we need to figure out what needs to be at the global level. And so Roderick, for example, says it's things that are trying to prevent beggar thy neighbor policies, so tax cooperation. If you've read the Pandora Papers news in the last week, I mean, that's clearly an area where we could use stronger global cooperation, and that cooperation in turn would be supporting greater government economic activism. I mean, that's a great example. He gives the example of exchange rate, competitive exchange rate policies or breaking up cartels. He adds examples like global commons issues, clearly need some global attention, climate change. I would add, international lender of last resort functions to address financial fragility and debt issues. I think we still have the need for global action on global redistributive politics. And we can think of other ones, sure, but there are lots of things that don't need to be done at the global level. And if they don't need to be done at the global level, we should probably not try to do them at the global level. It's going to be difficult to do. And so, just to give you, just to sum up that point, is just to highlight that we're looking at, I think, a more decentralized form of global economic governance, which has plurilateral forms of cooperation, regional forms, in some cases strictly national forms. Lots of things the governments can do on their own. It should be less constraining, and it should be more accommodating and supportive of government economic activism, whatever that might be. And it's going to take different forms in different parts of the world. So let me just finish up with a couple of examples, and then I'll stop. Tax cooperation, I've already mentioned, I think is a great example of that. And it's not just with respect to the issues relating to the Pandora Papers, but it's also the recent agreement around taxing multinational corporations, especially the digital economy. That's clearly a central thing. And if we could solve that well, and we're making some progress, I think, towards that, that would be the kind of global economic governance which is supportive and accommodating of higher degrees of government economic activism. Think of the revenue that could be used by governments if that's successful. I think another example is the IMF's SDR issue during the pandemic. It's the largest ever SDR issue, and it's useful for redistributive purposes. It could be done better, but it's a good first step. And then I think a third example, and again, this is at the global level, is some of the forms of central bank cooperation that did take place in this crisis that were pretty striking. And they're kind of below the radar. They're not always in the headlines, but it's pretty intensive cooperation, and some of it's quite impressive. And it shows you can do certain things that are in turn supportive of some goals around stability and things that are useful. Okay, so just to sum up that fourth point, is to say, look, we're not going to have a Bretton Woods conference. It's not an era in which that's going to happen. We're going to be stumbling backwards from a degree of high hyper-globalization into degrees of deglobalization, or at least alternate forms of globalization that are governed in more decentralized way. I like to think of this as kind of a cooperative decentralization, if we can pull it off well. And although there will be, I think, no Bretton Woods conference to do that, it'll be incremental. It'll have terrible setbacks at sometimes, but incremental progress in other ways. If it's not successful, I think we will have moves towards greater autarky as the way to address these issues of the desire for greater government economic activism. Okay, let me sum up then. Just to sum up, 4 core points. I think global economic governance has to adapt to a heightened interest in greater economic activism by national governments. I just think that's a reality. And this isn't new. We shouldn't say this is a new thing. It's actually at the core of what the embedded liberal vision of Bretton Woods was. But third point, we don't want to go back to that one because there were lots of things that didn't talk about that I think should be central to the politics of our time. And then finally, it's challenging to do this in a context where multilateral cooperation is difficult. And so it's going to be incremental, and it's probably got to be somewhat decentralized. And so I just want to end by saying, these are speculative comments. I have no idea if any of the points I've made are accurate or correct, whether I'm predicting the future well. I'm just trying to generate some discussion. And I also want to emphasize, and that's one reason that's really interested in participating in this roundtable is, that's my perspective in Canada. I'm sure it looks different in every part of the world right now. Everybody's experiencing the pandemic in such different ways. And so I'm very keen to see and to hear the Brazilian perspectives on this issue. But I hope the comments are interesting, at least, and I look forward to hearing the next speakers.
Thank you, Professor Helleiner. Thank you very much. I think I wouldn't expect that you would come with Bretton Woods, although it's so present in your scholarship. But it brings a lot of things to me. And okay. Before giving the floor to Gabriel, I would just like to emphasize one issue that you touched, but I have not developed, and I think that is crucial for us Brazilians and for many emerging and developing countries, which is inequality. And when I think, for me, this is the most important issue to emerging and mostly developing countries in the pandemic. And we can go back to some of the points you made, like even about state-led development or state-led social security. And this was a kind of luxury policy for many of the developing and emerging countries, because we did not have fiscal space for that. And we also had a lot of political struggle in Brazil especially, but I'm not going to talk about Brazil just at the moment. I'll wait for Gabriel and his ideas. But I think this is the most difficult point, because the pandemic has exacerbated inequality within countries and among countries in the whole world. And so the global economic governance would need to deal with that somehow. But we don't see it, and it goes in the direction of what you said about a weaker multilateralism, or also weak initiatives in regional initiatives. Like we in South America, in Latin America, have a lot of regional institutions and organizations, and they were not able to do a thing during the pandemic. And we haven't seen any collaboration, any cooperation among countries. So I just want to start with that and give the floor to Gabriel, and then thank you very much. It was very inspiring.
Thank you, Professor Tuka. Thank you very much, Professor Helleiner. I think I will start by building on what Professor Tuka just said, because she touched one of the points I also had flagged, which is first the inequality, but how emerging countries will differ vis-a-vis developed economies in terms of this new economic activism. I know that there's some enthusiasm in the US, mostly on the back of, these ambitious plans by the Biden administration. And we've seen some paradigm changes within the IMF and institutions that used to, advocate for more fiscal discipline. And this has already inspired some politicians in Latin America. But I'm always struggling to understand to which extent emerging economies can, in fact, emulate these trends, given that we have, chronic deficits, chronic problems associated with inflation. Professor Tuka mentioned Brazil, but if we take Argentina or even Uruguay, which is a fairly stable country politically, it's always a bit tricky to have narratives inspiring politicians in the sense of, the US is spending more, so why not? I'm keen to hear your thoughts on will emerging countries be able to emulate this trend, or should we do something else, given, the particularities of our economies? Particularities, by the way, that precede the pandemic and even the 2019 economic crisis. I think it will be particularly important for the Brazil 2022 elections. I understand that there will be a debate on which economic policies should we implement, given the failed state of the social landscape at this moment. So if you could please share your thoughts on that, I think that would be truly helpful.
Before we get back to the questions, we have here Alexandre has a specific question for you. But before Alexandre asks his question, I think that it would be interesting to look at at least the once big emerging economies, or even emerging powers like Brazil, India, China, which is not emerging, has emerged already, and try to think what is left for these countries in the building process of a new global economic governance, or if it is at all some intentions of building a new global economic governance. So just to put another point here, Alexandre, please.
Thank you, Professor Tuka, and Professor Helleiner, thank you very much for a brilliant lecture. I read the book organized by you and Professor Jonathan Kirchner in 2014, called The Great Wall of Money, on political economy and the Chinese currency. Could you tell us a little bit with 2021 perspective about the institutional relations between China and the IMF? For example, do you believe that China and its relation with the IMF's regulations are more rule maker or rule breaker, or even more disruptive that you can think about in 2021? Thank you very much, Professor Eric Helleiner.
So would you like to make a first round now, or let us pick some questions from the audience? I don't know, Ana Flavia, if you have a lot. But let's make a first round now. I think we still have time. Yeah, please.
Sure, I'd be happy to. These are all really interesting and important points. Maybe I can just begin with Henry's comments first about China's role in the IMF. Yeah, it's a difficult thing to analyze, I think, at the moment. When as you say, we did produce this volume, I guess that's 7 years ago now, when, in a sense, you could see China playing both of those roles. I think, actually, we had kind of 3 different roles at that time that it was playing in some ways simultaneously. So trying to reform the existing system, voting rules, the chairs and shares issues, all those kinds of things, staffing issues as well at the IMF. And at the same time, that was 2014, so creating the CRA, the contingent reserve arrangement, as is that an alternative? People are trying to understand exactly. I mean, I don't think it was much of an alternative in the sense that so much of the funds relied on IMF conditionality. And then there was kind of a more general question of, was China promoting bilateral swaps at that time, RMB swaps, which in a sense would move away from the multilateral order more generally. So looking at that 7 years later, it's not something I've been working on directly, so I can't claim any great expertise on it. But my sense, just following the news and listening to colleagues who are researching it more carefully than I am recently, all those things are still going on. Whether the balance has changed is maybe the interesting question. I do think the bilateral initiatives of China are more prominent compared to that earlier period. And that's a kind of an interesting thing to watch because, as you probably know, when the US was rising as a creditor in the interwar period, its initial foreign aid policies were bilateral and largely to Latin America. The US quickly ran into troubles of a very similar kind that China is running into now, which was opposition from countries receiving the money, feeling like this was a new form of imperialism. So in the US case, it was nationalist opposition across Latin America to what was called dollar diplomacy back then. And today you see growing discontent in many countries receiving US or Chinese bilateral funds about, are there strings attached? What's the degree of control when debt crises happen? So that's one problem. But the other problem the Americans ran into by the late 1930s that China is definitely experiencing now is the debt problems. And so you lend, but you may not have had great knowledge about where you're lending. You're just so enthusiastic about it. And that was certainly the American situation in the interwar period. And I think it has been the situation for Chinese lending. And so they have huge debt problems now, which need to be resolved somehow. And those two things, interestingly, in the earlier experience, is what led the US into the Bretton Woods framework. Like they became interested in multilateralism as a way to solve the problems created by bilateral lending. And so I think it's interesting. I certainly see signs of that the Chinese officials are aware of the problems created by their enthusiasm for bilateral, and they're looking for other, and it's partly political problems. It's better to diffuse the lender. It doesn't look like it's all China. It's a multilateral institution doing it. But it's also the risks, the financial risks associated with the lending at the international level, which have been there for hundreds of years and will not go away, the risk of sovereign default. And so you also see, the relationship to the Paris Club right now. China's relationship to the Paris Club is the subject of intense debate in Chinese policymaking circles for the same reason, I mean, the Paris Club was created by creditors to deal with debt problems, and China now has those debt problems. So that's a long way of saying, I think what happened after 2014 was a growing interest in bilateralism, was my sense. But now I think there's a bit of a reconsideration of that because of some of the problems that emerged from that. And whether your enthusiasm then for multilateralism goes into regional institutions or BRI, Belt and Road Initiative institutions, or whether it goes to the global multilaterals, I think that's a more difficult question to answer. I think it probably doesn't help that US-China friction is rising, and it's clear it's not just Trump. You know, it's across the US foreign policy establishment right now, and it seems like across the Chinese foreign policy establishment. And so the idea of, you know, if you're a Chinese official saying, you know, we should be throwing more eggs into the IMF basket as a way of solving the problems we have, that seems unlikely if the IMF remains US dominated. So then you're probably looking at alternative institutions, or at least different mechanisms of that kind. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's, I don't think we can say right now, but you may have more expertise. I'd be curious to hear your views. So please come back, Alejandra, if you've got some insights on that. I also think, and I'd be pretty interested in views about this, because my sense is China's lending relationships are very different in Latin America than they are in some other parts of the world. And so it might be that China's solutions to the problems that are emerging are different, you know, according to different regions. I don't know. But I'd be interested in hearing how Brazilian policymakers are thinking about that issue right now. And actually, if I can ask you one more question, you were asking me questions, but I am interested in how Brazil is thinking about the regional financial arrangements that have been growing, and some are very successful in Latin America in the context of relationships to China at the moment. So when a Latin American country is experiencing debt problems with China, are those Latin American regional institutions seen to be playing a role? Should they be playing a role? I'd be very curious to hear about that. And also how the Brazilian Development Bank is relating to those problems. So if any of you have comments about that, please tell me. I would love to hear. I'm just going to the other two questions quickly. Yeah, Maria's comment is a very important one about inequality. And I like the way Maria put that it's both inequality within countries, but also between countries. Both have been intensified by the crisis, I think, quite dramatically. And so I guess it's an interesting issue because just thinking of the Bretton Woods parallel, because it's often forgotten, at least maybe it's just me, but I'd forgotten it. But when I used to teach Bretton Woods, I never really used to teach that Bretton Woods was trying to address domestic inequality issues. Like I knew that in a kind of a general way, the New Deal and these things. But after the archival work I did about 10 years ago on this issue, I really came to understand that the Bretton Woods, a lot of the purpose of Bretton Woods was to address domestic inequality. And so, for example, when they write Article 6 into the IMF's Articles of Agreement, which is the right to use capital controls under any circumstance, that has some macroprudential concerns, but a lot of it is about domestic inequality. Should we allow the elite of each country to export their savings at that point in time to Switzerland? And there's a lot of concern about that. And, you know, it's eroding tax bases. Taxes are used to redistribute income. And so, in a sense, the embedded liberal order, as John Ruggie called it, was about addressing domestic inequality. Like it's quite striking. And so I think if we're moving back to that, that should be forefront on the agenda. I was part of a project that some of you might have seen with Jose Antonio Ocampo, which was trying to look at how national inequality trends intersect with international economic governance. And there are many fascinating chapters in that about this issue. And I wrote one about Bretton Woods trying to make that point, that Bretton Woods, actually that was at the center of Bretton Woods' concern. Now the other question, though, is the international inequality. And I think Bretton Woods was addressing that in a more indirect way. Like the World Bank lending was kind of generally seen to be doing that. but honestly, it was more about freedom from want, like making sure there's no poverty anywhere in the world, rather than a kind of sense of the relative positions. I think that's my general view on that. And so that's again, I put as an issue that needs better attention this time around compared to the Bretton Woods tax havens. If we could address that problem, that would do a lot for international inequality. And then the final question, which is a very interesting one about that Gabriel was raising, about to what extent can what he's calling emerging countries do activist policies, if I understand correctly Gabriel's concern. Yeah, so this is a big question. And I think it's just hugely varied across the world. And so some countries responded to the some countries responded to the East Asian crisis, by building up reserves and doing more local currency denominated debt. And all that was good, because when 2008 happened, they were less vulnerable. And the macroeconomic room for maneuvering of many countries in 2008 was much higher than it had been, like some lessons had been learned. But my sense then is in the last cycle between that crisis and the crisis we've been living through, some of those lessons were unlearned, as debt levels have risen pretty dramatically. And some of that debt was foreign currency debt. So yeah, it's just going to differ by countries. But the issue more generally of how we resolve sovereign debt restructuring is like the perennial issue. We still don't have a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. Things have been improved, like the collective action clauses have better clauses now than they did before, but it's not really, the kind of solution that Anne Kruger was proposing in 2001. A real sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. And incidentally, the idea of a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism also was discussed at Bretton Woods, but they couldn't get agreement even then. So it's just a very thorny issue. It's like a hardy perennial, for those of you who are gardeners, that just keeps rising. It's rising to the surface. We all know it's necessary, but it's very difficult to fertilize that plant appropriately. And so we have not been able to address that. And so we're stumbling through each crisis with these ad hoc mechanisms, and that will happen again, no doubt, over the next year or two with the debt problems that seem to be emerging. So it's not a very good answer to your question, but I hope that addresses it a little bit. But I'm very curious to hear from some of you, maybe before we go to the questions, just about this issue of China and Latin American financial regionalism.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting what you asked, and actually, I'm part of a research group dealing with Latin America and European issues in crisis, and we're trying to look at it and look specifically at the regional financial arrangements and to what extent to which they could help in crisis. And what we have seen so far, and not even before the pandemic, is although there are lots of arrangements put in place in Mercosur, in FLAR, the Latin American Fund for Reserves, and a lot of things that already exist, but they were not used at all. And it has been, and I think so far during the pandemic, as if each country has to deal with its own businesses and has to save itself. And the regional mechanisms were absolutely absent. And so at this point, another issue you raised is about central bank collaboration. It's crazy because we haven't seen any central bank regionals helping or cooperation. although we have seen the Federal Reserve lending or making swaps to the Brazilian central banks and to other central banks to guarantee liquidity. So it's absolutely, I think, of course, it's we always say that, but it's a political issue, especially because we have different governments in Latin America, since like Argentina and Brazil are very differently oriented politically, and they are struggling with their domestic political problems. Also in Argentina, they had like a huge crisis last month after the pre-elections they had. So it's very hard to foresee a kind of cooperation, although people know it is important and the institutional mechanisms are there. We could dig into them and use them, especially if something with China arises. And and for all the largest economies in Latin America, China is not Mexico, but China is becoming, or is already for years, the most important trade partner. So it's puzzling because we don't see that, but there are many scholars dealing with that and also defending that it must be worked on. But with the Brazilian government we have now, nothing is possible. Absolutely nothing. And it's, I mean, I guess I'm not going to tell you, I guess you're following more or less, but it's absolutely crazy. There's no social policies, there's no even exchange rate policy is not something that you can look at and understand which way they're going, even with monetary policy. Okay, now you see we are in inflation targeting, but it's absolutely crazy what we're going through. High, very, very high inflation, enormous increase in poverty, in inequality, lots of people, homeless people everywhere in big cities. It's something that you can just see going out. And so it's very difficult, and the government is not even trying to talk about cooperation or to talk about international arrangements. And Brazil, it's very let's say there is a crazy external policy. I mean, what is Brazil is dealing with it's not dealing well with environment, everything that we are deforesting, everything. So there's so many problems, and it's so hard to deal with them that no regional possibilities are being put in place.
Do you know if the Chinese policymaking circles are interested in Latin American financial regionalism?
At the moment, we haven't had special arrangements with Chinese. We had in the past a swap, and it was over, if I'm not mistaken, Alexandre must know exactly the date, but it was not renewed after that. China deals a lot with Chile, and used to have regional, I don't know if it's a regional bank or industry and trade bank in Argentina, but so far, I mean, that's what we have. I don't know if Alexandre and Gabriel have more data, more information.
Yes, Professor Maria. Unfortunately, Brazil had a swap agreement with China until 2016. But after that, the Central Bank of Brazil didn't renew it. Like Argentina and like Chile. And right now, Chile and Argentina have clearing banks. But I believe that this is the Bank of China, Buenos Aires, and Santiago Bank of China in Santiago. There are 2 RMB offshore centers there. They are truly related with China. But unfortunately, in Brazil, you don't have. For example, such clearing banks are able to settle trade agreements and trade among them, but Brazil, unfortunately, doesn't have right now. But this is the reality. Then I truly believe that, as Professor Maria Antonieta told us, the financial integration in America Latina and better with China, Brazil is losing a great opportunity to integrate with international financial system, and especially with the RMB offshore centers around the world, like New York, London, Europe, and even Asia. And Argentina and Chile are getting this opportunity.
Yeah, and if I may bring additional evidence to what you guys just said, I believe it was the beginning of the year that when Brazil actually defaulted on the BRICS Bank, which showcases both the interest and the capacity of the Brazilian government to, be truly engaged in these initiatives. And speaking of regional integration from a financial perspective, I think an interesting anecdote was, I believe 2 years ago, when Economy Minister Paulo Guedes actually suggested the creation of the so-called peso real, integrating the Brazilian and the Argentine economies. And it was treated like a joke in both countries, which it was, by the way. And then, and obviously, Paulo Guedes made this speech underlining the, the potential for integration for the 2 economies that, in his opinion, it could be better. And then when Brazil did not grow enough in the same year, he blamed the situation in Argentina after saying that we were not connected enough. So, we have experienced a series of episodes that highlight, the lack of leadership from the largest economy, which I think, and Professor Tuca shared a few, but the many domestic challenges facing the region. We have obviously the political challenges facing Kirchnerism in Argentina, but also an ongoing constitutional process in Chile. We had massive, widespread unrest in Colombia, Ecuador in recent years. So I just don't think the region has been able to focus on the outside while they face, most countries face significant domestic challenges. And I think the outlier here would be, once again, Uruguay. And this has been showcased by I think the announcement of 3 weeks ago of the Lacalle-Pou administration of an intention to pursue a trade deal with China, which I found very interesting. It's technically not allowed. I know that Ana Flávia, Professor Tuca, and Alexandre will know better, but it's not really allowed by the Mercosur chapters. But the president of Uruguay is looking for a way around, because he knows that he cannot rely on Bolsonaro or Argentina to work with external partners. So just to sum up, I think we are in a very delicate situation with regards to integrating the region to the outside, even with China, which is our main trade partner. Not sure you guys agree.
I would like to add something, since we are talking about political economy. That is, I don't know if Professor Helleiner saw, but we had some issues, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, with Bolsonaro and his sons making comments, very xenophobic comments about China and the virus, and that escalated for a bad diplomatic issue that the Chinese ambassador in Brazil had to talk, and I think that kind of influenced in how our trade with China will go or is going. I think my view about this is that we probably we will be needing China in the next years, because as Professor Maria was saying, the economy is really bad, and we have elections next year, 2022, and it's going to be a huge change if we get out of Bolsonaro. But I think China could be one good solution for, I don't know if you guys agree with me, for our economy, but I think that is.
Yeah, I agree. I think in many ways, China has been the supporter of last resort for the region. And I also remember another case, I think it was 2019 again, or just before the pandemic, when Brazil auctioned some oil fields across the country. And the government sensed that there was no really interest by private companies. And even though Bolsonaro and his family were fighting with, the China ambassador, as Ana Flávia said, Paulo Guedes went to China and said, "Hey, please ask your state-owned companies to buy at least, I think it was 5% of some of the oil blocks." So we have this annoying game of increased ideology, but persistent dependence. And I think, as everyone just agreed, we are not moving forward. We are probably stuck in this trap. And I think as the situation of the Chinese economy deteriorates, and it seems it is at this moment, we will be once again, following suit and having little to say in our economic destiny.
Can I ask one other question? To what extent are these trends that you're describing in Brazilian foreign economic policy just very idiosyncratic to the current regime? Or do they also reflect some broader structural trends that a new regime would still echo? I ask that only because when Trump was in power, we many people said, "Oh, when Trump leaves office, everything will be back to normal." But it's the Biden administration has kept many of the Trump foreign economic policies. I wonder if that's similar in the Brazil's case.
Oh, I'm just starting. 1 minute. I think yes, but not. I'm not. I don't think that we can say it precisely how to what extent, but because it's so caricatural, it's so strong what we have now that it's impossible, because they have been like deconstructing bridges, deconstructing relationships with organizations, with countries, etc. And so in my opinion, even if we have in next year's election a very different alternative, which I hope for, like more left-wing oriented and more social policy oriented and environment oriented, it will be very hard to change everything, the whole mess they have done in 4 years. And before this government, we have been in a huge crisis. The crisis started in 2014, and we had 2015 and 16 real recession, and we had a lot of trouble. And within all that, in the middle of all that, in 2016, we had a Congress coup. In my opinion, it was a coup against the Workers' Party, which was in power. And it made such a it brought so much uncertainty to all expectations and to all policies that the economy just stopped. And with this government, it went worse and worse. It's something that, and I think I'm not exaggerating, every day we have some new policies or new initiatives or new tries at least to dismantle the state structure. And even structures, I don't know if you have been following, but this government is also going against the judicial system, against the Supreme Court, etc. So I think anything will be better than this. It's, I don't know, it's very obvious to say that, but I don't know. You guys...
Yeah, thank you, Professor Tuca. I think I'm slightly more optimistic than you when you say that it will be very difficult to, clean the mess. Because I think other stakeholders sort of understand that this is a problem, a very Bolsonaro-intensive problem. And I think one case is the Mercosur agreement with the European Union. It seems that they are literally just waiting for him to be gone to, start the ratification process. And I also, I don't want to sound too, overly optimistic, but I believe that Itamaraty, which is the foreign ministry in Brazil, also holds some state capacity that is significant. And that could be similar to what we've seen with vaccination recently. So when Bolsonaro, took his hands out of the vaccination rollout, we really saw it advancing and actually surprising the world positively. So I think this sort of state capacity is still there in some areas of the administration, and Itamaraty should be one of them. I think you guys know more diplomats than I do, but they are still there somewhere. Maybe they're hiding from the controversies that arise when they have to represent Bolsonaro. But I think in terms of international relations, it will be really a matter of, bringing these people back and making agenda shifts accordingly. And I think the main one will be on, as you said, Professor Tuca, on the environmental front. I think it's the most important in the context of the European Union agreement, but also in the context of the relations between Brazil and the US and other developed economies. I'm not sure, Ana Flávia, Alexandra, if you have any thoughts on that.
I agree with Gabriel and Professor Maria. I think Bolsonaro and his family are the personification of the problem. People see that they cause the mess and the chaos, and they use Twitter very similar to Trump and his sons when we see the problem. but I think it's going to be hard to rebuild everything that they messed up, and the diplomatic relations. I think there are a lot of pressure now for the next one, if we can take him out of the presidency, to do more about the environment in Amazonia. And so to rebuild this relation, I think this next person will have to act very actively to show to Europe and the US, especially Europe, especially France, that we can make and we will do something to protect our forests and our environment. And I think this will be a very great challenge, because we have a agricultural and very powerful men that want the forests down because they want meat, they want it to export. So the government will have a challenge there, I think. I don't know, Alexandre has anything to say, Professor Helleiner, if there's anything to say.
No, for me it's okay. It depends on the next president of Brazil, and it's a risk to maintain the same politics, but it's very, very difficult to have any preview or broadcasting of what could happen in financial politics in Brazil.
Yeah, I think assuming that this is a result of Brazil's notorious institutional weakness, which I think it is, the fact that it was, the so-called mess was caused by an overly personalized approach, I think analogically, we should expect that an opposite approach from a different person would be able to, put us back on track. But I agree that it's not an easy task. And obviously the next president will inherit many challenges, including, more priority ones. I don't see the president of Brazil in 2023 being able to, spend too much time abroad while we have 40 or 15% of unemployment and 20, I don't know how many percent of people who are not even going out to look for jobs. But I do, assuming that there will be intent, and as I said, I believe there is some capacity. I think we have an interesting opportunity around climate change. We've been discussing environmental policies here, but I sense that Brazil, once again, will be in the spotlight because it's both a country that will be among the most impacted, given the inequality we have, but also the demographics across the country, but also the country that can contribute the most. So if the next president, he or she wants to, engage this agenda, this building Brazil's brand better, I think this will be a very interesting starting point. I'm not sure if you guys agree.
I think we must give the floor to the audience. I took a look at YouTube. There are some questions there. Ana Flávia, do you have them? You connected?
I do, yeah. I would like to thank all the comments. And if you guys in the YouTube have questions, please put them on the chat, or Natalia will be sending them to me. So the first one is from Ana Carolina, and she's asking if regarding the relevance of the environment issues in global economic governance, if it's being really considered, and did the pandemic set off any alerts in the direction of actual transformation? It is for now.
Professor Helleiner, would you like to start? Should we address the first one and then come back? How do you guys prefer?
I think we can start answer this one so people can put the questions in the chat. For now, it's the only one. So then we can reopen again, if that's okay.
Sure, I can say a couple things about that. I think it's interesting that in some ways the degree of state action on the pandemic has emboldened some public opinion to think, well, if you can do it in public health, why can't you do it with another existential threat that society faces? And so to that extent, I think the pandemic has helped the environmental cause, if for no other reason than saying, look at the things you can do when humanity feels threatened. You can, the state can do a lot of things quite dramatically. And I've certainly heard environmentalists make that case, at least during the pandemic. I think in the question of whether anything is happening in that realm, like I work mostly in financial issues, and so I have been very struck by the extent to which the official sector, central banks, now the IMF as well, financial regulators, like the whole kind of epistemic community of policymaking networks around finance have become engaged with the climate change issue. And they've done it through a narrative, several narratives, but the most interesting one to me is the one around prudential risk, essentially saying risks have not been evaluated correctly. If you really take climate change seriously, you need to be evaluating prudential risk differently. And that framing has been politically, I think, very successful in convincing what are otherwise often quite conservative officials to take it seriously. And the more that the regulatory community and the central banking community takes up that discourse, the more they can introduce prudential rules that really do redirect global capital flows in quite significant ways. And so, all the attention is on trade issues or things that are easier for people to grasp. But some of these prudential rules, if you're to change the Basel risk weightings, for example, or these quite technocratic things, it has huge impact on the direction that capital moves. And so I've been interested, and that's really been what the last 3 or 4 years or so, and it seems to be gaining momentum rather than losing momentum. And the Biden people are quite interested in this issue as well, so they've been encouraging it, and the European financial community is quite interested in the issue. And you may think I'm biased because a Canadian has also been at the center of all of this. Mark Carney, who was the head of the Bank of England, and was also before that involved with the regulatory community quite actively. And he really took up this cause and I think played a major role in convincing people. So that's just to say, I don't think nothing is being done. I think to move the capital flows is a big deal if we can get that happening more actively. Now, if you're a more radical environmentalist, you'll think, well, that's just reforming capitalism in micro ways, and that's true. It's not a system transformation, but we don't have a lot of time, and so any little incremental move is, in my view, is to be applauded, even while we try to do other more transformative things at the same time.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with Professor Helleiner, and I do think that the pandemic did set some alarms, but the question whether we are paying attention to them, I think should be a different one. But if we take, and again, sorry to insist on that, but if we take climate change as the next pandemic, or a pandemic on steroids, if you wish, in terms of impact, and try to see some, to check for lessons learned in terms of global governance and, a new paradigms. I can think of a few alerts that were set by the pandemic that will be valid for this ongoing crisis, upcoming crisis. For example, it's a problem that has been, so both problems have been and will be exacerbated by globalization. They are both drivers of inequality, and they are also have different impacts depending on existing inequality levels. They're both complex problems that require significant coordination and often unpopular solutions. They also show us that neither the private or the public sector can, solve everything by themselves. So an additional need for coordination across the two. It has also been a super fertile environment for conspiracy theories, which have tested the resilience of institutions. And I think on that note, I would like to pass the ball back to Professor Helleiner. When you were discussing, trends on the global governance landscape going forward, you mentioned a few stakeholders. You talked about changes in the IMF, obviously changes in the US and China. But I think it was last week that there was an article in Bloomberg. It was obviously very provocative, not an academic one, but it was literally called "Give Facebook and Amazon a Seat in the United Nations." I think it came when Facebook went down, and obviously the entire economies in the Western hemisphere got super anxious. So my question would be, how do you see the role of multinationals, namely big tech, in this context? I sense that they have been super important for the good and the bad during the pandemic, and I don't see them not being, once again, essential when tackling climate change and other economic challenges going forward, actually.
Yeah, it's the whole issue of mega companies, I think, in the current era is one that IPE has not devoted the attention we think that it should, especially to the question of antitrust. How do you coordinate antitrust across borders? This is not just in the big tech sector, it's in the food sector, it's in a number of other sectors at the moment. We're living through an era of corporate concentration, which has parallels to the late 19th century, the great era of the trusts. And I wish more IPE scholars were working on this, to be honest. I think it's a really important PhD topic if students are out there looking for PhD topics. It's a complicated topic. You need legal expertise, you need economic expertise, and of course you need political expertise. But the legal side of it is particularly interesting. And the people doing the best work on this generally have legal training. They're not IPE scholars in my experience. And so we should be engaging more with those scholars, I think, because we have a lot of insights that they could use. But it's for me, it's one of the top, 5 or 6 issues of the current era. The big tech side of it is particularly interesting for someone like me who works on money and finance, because, as you know, Facebook even proposed its own currency several years ago. And it wasn't a joke. I mean, they meant it quite seriously, and they had some pretty heavy hitters allied with them behind the Libra. It was called the Libra proposal at that time. And I think that was a bit of a wake-up call for the central banking community about the extent to which the changing world of technology driven by the big tech companies is changing everything, including financial plumbing. And so they, I haven't been following what's been going on in Brazil, so you'll have to fill me in on that. But many central banks now have active research programs on creating their own digital currency. And of course, China has been doing this for many years, and they will probably have a launch during the Olympics. And Bahamas has already got theirs going. Bank of Canada has an active plan going forward. European Central Bank and the Fed is even a little bit behind everybody, but now actively trying to catch up. And that's driven partly by some sense of interstate rivalry. So in the case of China being ahead of everybody, I think there's a little bit of that sense, but a lot of it was driven by the fear of what Facebook had proposed. And what's interesting is Facebook was forced to scale back their proposal in reaction to to regulators' opposition. And a lot of it was linked to the issue that you're interested in, Anna Flavia, about money laundering, that it was an opening that they could use, that the Libra proposal probably would have fostered more money laundering. And unless Facebook was willing to abide by all these rules, the regulators were really going to crack down on them. And then other issues came in, but that was one that was particularly prominent. What I have to say, really, I think is interesting is in countries that are experiencing currency instability, high degrees of inflation, in particular, and kind of distrust in a national monetary authority. Many countries in that circumstance, I think, are attracted to these private cryptocurrency arrangements. I think I've read that in Brazil, there's many millions using cryptocurrencies at this point, but you'll have to correct me if that's wrong. And it's certainly true in many other places. And of course, El Salvador has done this in a legal sense recently. But it seems like the world of the Facebooks and the other, and some of these different kinds of private cryptocurrency issuers, they have more opening in countries experiencing that kind of circumstance. But I'd like to hear what's going on. Is there an active Brazilian debate about this? Is the Brazilian Central Bank considering a digital currency, for example?
Yes. This year, the Brazilian Central Bank started this debate, both because of private digital currencies are coming and people are dealing with them, and also starting the discussion about the official central bank digital currency. But so far it has been discussed, and there are many information in the central bank website, some seminars, open seminars, but not a step, a concrete step hasn't been made yet. But yes, it is. Yeah, I think another issue related to what we're seeing, and it has to do, of course, with all that, is the energy problems that come together with the climate change and everything that came during the pandemic, that was also exacerbated, and it's Brazil is also facing a very important energy, I wouldn't say crisis yet, but that's just because they haven't started asking people to control. Well, to control, yes, but not. They are not yet facing like shortages, but it's coming soon, and yeah.
And what is the cause of that in Brazil's case? Because each country seems to have different causes of.
Yeah, in Brazil, it is related to climate, because we haven't been having enough rain, and most of the energy metrics, it's based on hydroelectricity. And all the dams are very, very low. And so they started, because we had an energy crisis in 2001. And after that, they started building or recreating some, how do you call them? Thermoelectricity. But most of, I think, kind of 80% of the Brazilian energy is still hydroelectricity, and so mostly, so it's absolutely connected to the climate change.
Yeah, and if I may, Professor Tuca, this is another evidence of that point we were discussing earlier, of the reduced capacity for emerging economies to, be expansionist as some developed economies are, because, we have a drought, prices increase, we have double-digit inflation. We cannot just, print money as we would wish. So we have a number of structural problems. Of course, this one is now related to climate change, is obviously a consequence of new extreme weather events. It's not affecting only Brazil, but I am truly concerned about the lack of capacity for countries like Brazil, but I believe virtually all emerging economies, to be able to be bolder in terms of their state capacity, given that they come already with pre-existing challenges that are mainly structural. So yeah, that I think that raises another red flag on that front, if that makes sense.
Is there also challenges around supply chain, international supply chain issues in Brazil at the moment? Because it seems like many countries there's a higher degree of debate, I think, than I've ever seen in my lifetime about the benefits of national self-reliance and reducing vulnerability to international supply chain. Is that going on in Brazil as well?
I think Gabriel, for his job, he's looking closely to that, more closely, but I just want to give one example, which is fertilizers and agriculture. We're going into, I think it's going to be a crisis, because not only because of energy prices and oil prices, but also because of our devaluation, currency devaluation. It became extremely expensive, and it will certainly have impact on the production, next year's production.
Yeah, also in the automotive sector, I've seen some cases recently, but once again, this is another case of a global problem affecting Brazil, but adding to domestic challenges, because in Brazil, in addition to the supply challenges that come from China, we also have strike threats by truck drivers, because they are obviously unhappy with gas prices. So it's another case in which we have the difficulties of carrying structural legacy problems to additional or incoming trends. Just another to evidence there, I believe.
We have one more question from the audience. Can I say it? Okay, I'm gonna read it. It's from Thales, and he's asking, the pandemic and financial cases such as the Evergrande indicates that the global economy needs to diversify their safe places to invest beyond China, or the future scenarios show us another result, concentrating even more the economy in financial centers. That's an interesting one.
Eric, would you start, please?
Yeah, it sounds like someone looking for investment advice. And you should never listen to an IPE scholar if you're looking for investment advice. Yeah, it's an interesting question whether the Chinese financial problems will lead, in a sense, to a reconcentration around the traditional financial centers or not. Yeah, I haven't thought that through carefully, but I'll just mention a couple of things maybe that come to mind. One is that I do think it will lead to some degree of financial decoupling because the risks are now perceived as much higher than they were, I think. And I think there, I could be wrong, but I think that many investors needed to read more political science than they had. They assumed that the Chinese state would bail out international investors if there was any problem with the Chinese borrower. And now, that's not so clear. And I think before there was just a sense that Chinese state banks are behind this, and ultimately that's all backed up by the Chinese government. But Xi Jinping, I think, is making clear that there are certain lines in the sand that he will draw, and certain things will be bailed out and others won't. It's a very delicate operation that the Chinese authorities are trying to conduct right now, which is diffusing a financial bubble carefully. And if you've ever blown up a balloon and tried to deflate it carefully, you'll know how difficult that is to do. And so I think if I were an investor with lots of money, I would be very careful about my investments in China right now. It's just unclear, and it's a political situation. You can be the best econometrician in the world and have all of the Harvard Business School financial risk analyst techniques, but you need to know the politics in this situation to understand how it will play out. So that's maybe one partial answer to the question. But I think the other broader point it makes me think about is, anytime there's financial turbulence, markets generally retreat to some degree to national spaces, and for good reason, because it's your own state that you can trust more than others when it comes to legal proceedings and all kinds of things that you may need to invoke to get your money back. And so the more that the Chinese situation is unstable, I think the more you'll see some retreat. And the one exception to that rule historically is people going into U.S. Treasuries when there's financial instability. That's the one. So we had the bizarre situation in 2008 where the United States is at the center of the financial crisis, and the U.S. dollar is rising because everybody's pouring into U.S. Treasuries as a kind of safe haven. And that's, I think, what's particularly interesting at the moment in contrast to 2008, because U.S. political system is just looks a little more unstable than it did in 2008. And, they already had a default threat in 2013, and they've just gone through another episode last week. And they just basically kicked the can down till December. And so it's just an interesting question to me. At what point do U.S. Treasuries cease to be seen as the safe haven in the event of financial turbulence? I'm not saying we're at that point yet, but there will become a point where that is true. There'll be some other asset that people consider the safer haven. But it is an unusual confluence of events right now where you have the risk of financial instability in China at the very moment that you have the U.S. having difficulties addressing trust around government debt issues. And that's probably not a good combination for the stability of the system.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think I wouldn't be sure about diversified safe places, but I'm confident that this recent crisis reinforced the concentration around some saviors, which are states and central banks. And I think this is a feature of the financial system that's not going anywhere. So I don't know where investors will look in terms of allocating money, but I know to whom they will look when they need help, and that's absolutely central banks and governments. I saw, I think 2 weeks ago, this is obviously anecdotal, but some traders in Brazil, which are all, libertarian and minimum state and all these things, they were actually celebrating the fact that the Chinese government was willing to, put money into Evergrande. So that's no one is an atheist when there is a financial crisis. Everyone in the central banks and the government, and this is a feature that's not really going anywhere. I would say.
Reminds me of the slogan in the 2008 crisis. I've forgotten who first said it, but the slogan was that banks were global in life, but national in death.
Super true.
I have a friend who is a financial consultant, and just pop a message from him saying that he loved this last part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So can I ask another question around that? That when Brazil took the Fed swap in the recent crisis, was there any controversy within Brazil about that issue? Or is it not? It doesn't generate any controversy. Yeah.
No, because and it's so is interesting that it wasn't in the news. It's not that it wasn't in the news, but it was not an issue to be discussed. And this is weird because and maybe it can be explained by the fact that we have so many domestic problems and so unusual and unbelievable domestic problems that it was just nothing, not discussed at all. I mean, I was aware of reading IMF blogs or this kind of things or papers about this thing, but yeah.
So just to go back, sorry, go ahead, Gabriel.
Sorry, just very brief. I do remember some Bolsonaro supporters trying to sell it like it was a support by Trump, to say something along the lines here, listen, Bolsonaro is friends with Trump, they will both save us, you in the opposition know nothing. But even that did not resonate well because it contradicted the the narrative that was ongoing on the threats to national sovereignty that the World Health Organization was allegedly sponsoring. So even among Bolsonaro supporters, the narrative did not stick, if I'm not mistaken.
That's an interesting issue because the question of who the Fed decides to offer swaps to it's got a lot of attention from IPE scholars right now because it's really an important question, and it's not totally clear how the choices are being made, and because we know in 2008 there were many, and after a few years after, there were many foreign central banks asking for a Fed swap, and they were denied, but the Fed said yes to some other ones, and so it's just a bit unclear still from the research I've seen the extent to which the Fed is making decisions on the basis entirely of U.S. financial exposure, or whether there's some diplomatic concerns. We know from 2008 that the State Department was involved, but whether they were just approving decisions, is an argument that some people have made, they weren't actively choosing. But on the flip side, but I think there's been less research on the flip side, which is from the receiving end. That is there a big debate within the Brazilian Central Bank about the pros and cons of taking the swap, or is this one of these? I mean, I'm wondering if this is an example. You're talking about how the foreign ministry has high state capacity. Is the central bank another Brazilian institution that you would put in that category?
It's hard to tell. I haven't been following, I mean, this debate. I think it's not, I don't know. I don't know if you guys, but I haven't seen much attention on this issue, and it should attract attention. But I haven't seen that. Even I mean, I take a look at central bank, and I get mailing, etc. But I haven't seen this issue going on.
Yeah, this is interesting. I believe 12 people must have discussed this in Brazil, if that much, last year. I think there are so many other things going on, and it was at the beginning of the pandemic when we were faced with the unprecedented approach by the Bolsonaro administration, unprecedented for Brazilian standards, in terms of denying the severity of the crisis, and everyone concerned about the healthcare situation. I think we just could not focus on that. But I do believe that the central bank Brazil, in contrast with other parts of the public sector, including the executive branch, there is some high levels. Please, Professor Tuca, you know better, but I think in overall it's seen as a reliable institution. So in terms of precedent, a red flag would have to come with more controversies to trigger a more intense debate. I think people just see these things as a technicality among central bankers who know better, and it's not really a political issue. And I think one other thing that has probably amplified that is the fact that now the central bank in Brazil is formally autonomous since the beginning of this year. So I think it has shielded this sort of operations from political controversies even more. And I don't know, I personally see that development as positive, at least in the sense of providing the financial system with more predictability and stability, even if we still have double-digit inflation.
Yeah, I agree, and I just want to point that it's since the already in '99 we adopted inflation targeting system, and since then central bank has been very, I don't know if it's too much to say, but quite transparent, I would say, and has been working on that very clearly. There was, in my opinion, one moment when it wasn't the case. It was during the second term of President Dilma Rousseff, when she got desperate because there was not more space to grow based on domestic demand, and the economy was going down, and they started something that some economists call a new macroeconomic matrix, which was somehow even protectionist because it was taxes exemption to sectors that were exporting. A lot of things that they call this a new industrial policy. Yes, the policy we shouldn't name, and but everything went down because the inflation increased a lot, and the political system, the Congress started manipulating, and we came with this coup, this legislative coup, I would say. And so, but apart from that, the central bank has been okay. But there is something, let's say, at least bizarre, because the central bank governor now, although it is someone with good credentials, studying in the US, etc., this kind of things, but he is very close to the president. And he shows it publicly, like going to barbecues and not wearing masks, etc., etc. And it was somehow even more bizarre because he showed this kind of things after passing the bill of autonomy, central bank autonomy has been passed. So it's something that doesn't connect, doesn't go together with autonomy. But this is just one, but normally the central bank works quite okay. And he's trying to show that the governor and all the governors, the board, by increasing interest rates recently, which is, in my opinion, necessary, although the economy is not going well, but the inflation is exploding. So, yeah, that's the point. But, yeah. I guess we're getting to the time. I don't know. And Flavia, that's with you to organize.
Yes, we are at 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes to finish. So I would like to end up here, if it's okay with everyone. I would like to thank Professor Helleiner. I don't get it right anytime. Did I? I am so sorry.
Helleiner,
One day I will do it right, I promise. And Professor Maria for being here, and Gabriel for accepting this invitation. It was really good, the conversation. I really liked it. I hope you guys liked it. I will be speaking Portuguese very briefly before we finish the YouTube transmission, and then we can say goodbye properly. Então, terminamos aqui a nossa primeira mesa. Espero que vocês tenham gostado. Gostaria de agradecer a participação de todo mundo pelo YouTube. A gente tem mais um painel hoje de de política externa, desculpa. E queria avisar que as inscrições de ouvinte ainda estão abertas. Se você tem interesse em participar e ainda não se inscreveu, ainda temos mais 2 dias de seminário. E pedir para o Rodrigo terminar a transmissão. Muito obrigada, gente. Rodrigo?
Thank you very much, Professor Helleiner. Thank you, Professor Maria and Gabriel.